All right. Well, sir, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Chuck. Welcome to everybody. Thanks for tuning in. In 1903, Philippine Moro leaders elected Captain John J. Pershing, a fellow Datu, or chief, as the first and only American military man to be honored by Moro Datus as an equal. He became the American Datu, hence the title of this book, and you're looking at the cover of it. Captain Pershing's job at the time entailed fighting Moros, a local term for Philippine Muslims, as a military leader in America's imperial conquest of the Philippine Islands. Why would Pershing's sworn adversaries honor him with such a title? In the most creative time of his career, Pershing, the eventual leader of the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I, spent 9 years in the Philippines, 9 years, 7 of them fighting, pacifying, and governing Moros. Over that span of time, he developed, not without making mistakes, some prescient ideas about how best to fight small wars. This book argues that the years between 1899 and 1913, during which the US military conducted counterinsurgency operations against Philippine Moros, represent the American military's most successful foray into counterinsurgency warfare up to this post-Afghanistan day. I contend that the Moro War, as some call it, in which Jack Pershing played a central role, begs to be studied by anyone interested in American counterinsurgency strategy today. Next slide, please. A map of the Philippines. I just want to point out 2 things. First, most of the Philippines is occupied by Filipinos who identify as Christians, thanks to 350 years of Spanish colonial conquest of the Philippines and conversion of Filipinos to Roman Catholicism. Most of those Filipinos live in the North and the Central Islands and in some parts of Mindanao. But Mindanao, the southernmost island, is also occupied by a minority of Moros, or Philippine Muslims. Christians, identifying as that, number about 80 to 85% of Filipinos, about 10% are Moros or Muslims. The Philippine-American War, which is the time we're starting out with here in this presentation, was fought mainly against Filipinos demanding independence for the Philippine Republic against first the Spanish and then the Americans between 1899 and 1902. It was fought mainly in Luzon and the Visayas. It pitted Americans against Filipinos seeking independence. The Moro area, down there in the south, in the western part of Mindanao especially, was really a backwater in those years, particularly 1899 to 1901. A personal aside, I first became interested in the Philippines as a Peace Corps volunteer assigned to Bukidnon province in the uplands of Mindanao Island, right there in the center of Mindanao. While Bukidnon is inhabited mainly by non-Muslim Filipinos and Lumads. Lumads are upland people like the Bukidnon people. It's located on the border of Muslim Mindanao, and I was able to travel extensively through all of Mindanao, Muslim and non-Muslim. My book, entitled People of the Middle Ground, A Century of Conflict and Accommodation in Central Mindanao, chronicles how the Bukidnon people, like many, many people today around the world, accommodated and adjusted and negotiated with outside forces in order essentially to stay alive amid forces much stronger than themselves. They always kept to the middle ground. A key moment in my research for this book, American Datu, came during a visit to the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. That's when I met and conversed with Dr. Conrad Crane, who played a central role in conceptualizing and writing the U.S. Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual. He understood immediately the potential relevance of what I call progressive counterinsurgency in the Muslim Philippines to small war theory today. He encouraged me to focus on that aspect of my work on General Pershing. I thank him for that encouragement. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Yeah, it's just sticking here. Hold on. It's frozen. Just bear with me. Yep.
There we go.
There we are. Okay.
That's it right there. It's a shocking picture. It's not a photo of the Moro War a little over a century ago. It's a photo of Marawi City in 2017. Marawi City is a city of Muslims in the Muslim part of the Philippines. In May of 2017, elements of radical Muslim factions allied with ISIS occupied this city. And over the next 5 months, fighting raged in Marawi between insurgents and the Philippine armed forces. But by the time the AFP took back the city in October, over 1,200 people had died, 978 of them militants, 168 troops, and 87 civilians, according to official numbers. Much of the city had been destroyed, and 360,000 civilians had been forced to flee. Marawi has yet to be fully rebuilt. I have been there. I spent a couple of weeks there. It's a beautiful, beautiful city. This is a true catastrophe to see what has happened to it. What did militants hope to accomplish? They sought to force the Philippine government to grant independence to a new Moro Islamic Republic. This was not a new demand. For the last 50 years, since the 1970s, Moros have been struggling for autonomy, if not independence, from the rest of the Philippines. The Moro militant strategy worked, at least to some extent. The Marawi catastrophe convinced the present Philippine administration of Rodrigo Duterte to negotiate with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, to a relatively moderate faction seeking autonomy, not independence, for Moros in the Philippines. In 2018, the government and the MILF signed, and a subsequent Moro plebiscite in 2019 confirmed, the organic law creating the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region. Next slide, please. That's the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region there in the south, in the western section of Mindanao, and in the Sulu Archipelago, which is off of that arm of Mindanao on the western edge. Notice that it's not nearly all of Mindanao. If this had been done 100 years ago, it would have been much larger. But tens of thousands of Filipinos have migrated to the open lands of Mindanao in the last century. And so in the plebiscite in 2019, only Muslims in the areas that you see in red voted in favor of autonomy. But that has now been granted, and you have the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region. What does this have to do with the American Datu? Well, the Bangsamoro organic law has much actually in common with what American military leaders, including John Pershing, generally supported over a century ago. Some form of autonomy for Moros, the right to self-government, the right to their own legal system, the right to have their own police force to maintain the peace. Notice it's an autonomous region. It is not an independent country. That's not what Americans wanted 100 years ago. It's not what the Filipinos want today. One other comment about this is that today, 400 American special forces are in Mindanao to help the Philippine Army keep the peace there. Some amazing similarities between today and a century ago. With that introduction, let's go back to the book. The American Datu has three main focal points. First, John J. Pershing's role in his evolving ideas on counterinsurgency warfare. Two, a comparison of his ideas, which are really a form of indirect counterinsurgency, and those of Leonard Wood, a form of direct counterinsurgency. And a third main focal point, a comparison of Pershing's progressive counterinsurgency, as I call it, with current ideas on how best to fight small wars. Next slide, please. We're looking here at Mindanao and the sweeping across it, Moro province, created in 1903 by the Americans. Pershing had a role in that. I want to point out in particular, Holo Island in the Sulu archipelago. I'll be talking about that. Zamboanga, the city of Zamboanga, on the very tip of the arm of Mindanao, the western section of Mindanao. And then as your eyes move upward and to the right, Lanao district, which has Lake Lanao in it. That's where Pershing will first develop his ideas. South of Lanao district is Cotabato district. We'll talk about that. And then to the right of that is Davao. Notice the line above Davao, the 8th parallel, Bukidnon. That's where I was in the Peace Corps, is right above that. Not part of Moro Mindanao, but right on the border. Next slide, please. Pershing was posted purely by chance to Zamboanga in 1899, and he'll be there until 1901. This is the picture of Pershing, who's second from the left, with General Kobe and other officers in Zamboanga in those years. He was 41 years old at that time. Next slide, please. Zamboanga is a beautiful, beautiful town. This is a street at that time, 1900, of Zamboanga. And the next slide, please. A place also where much more humble dwellings, such as these, as part of the Moro segment of Zamboanga. Not all of Zamboanga was Moro. Some of it was inhabited, much of it was inhabited by Christian Filipinos. So they were living together in Zamboanga. Next slide, please. It's easy to exoticize Zamboanga because of these people and others. These are the Bajau, who live in houses to this day out over the water, providing an absolutely gorgeous kind of background to the lives of people living there, including the life of John J. Pershing in 1900 and 1901. Next slide, please. What does this have to do with counterinsurgency warfare? Well, Pershing and fellow officers in Zamboanga were not fighting Muslims in those first years. The war was raging, the Philippine-American War, in the northern and central parts of the islands, but not in the Moro area. The Moros didn't see themselves as having any part in that struggle. So Pershing and fellow officers were able to spend time to get to know the local populace, and Pershing indeed did that. He fell in love with a young woman named Joaquina Bandoy Ignacio. She may be in this picture, but I can't guarantee it. And he had 2 children by her. This is something that will be an important factor in his life, though he will always deny that paternity. Let's look to the next slide. The quiet life of Zamboanga begins to change in 1901 when Emilio Aguinaldo, depicted here, President of the Philippine Republic and General of the Armies, is captured and convinced to sign an oath of loyalty to the United States, at which point hundreds of his troops will follow. The war will continue until it is formally closed in July of 1902, but beginning, and there will continue to be struggles in islands like Samar and just south of Manila and Batangas, even after that. But the United States Army is able to shift some troops in 1901 to the Moro area, which had always been without very many troops at all during the quiet days of 1899 to 1901. Next slide, please. Again, we see Moro province. And again, let me point out Zamboanga there, and now the lake Lanao, because Pershing will be posted now from Zamboanga up to Lake Lanao, and he will be entrusted with the task of pacifying Mindanao Moros in the Lake Lanao area. Next slide, please. This is Lake Lanao, and he will be posted to Camp Vickers, which is down in the very bottom part of your map towards the left, Camp Vickers. Marawi city that I showed you a picture of, destroyed in 2017, is way up at the top of the map. Mindanao Moros lived all around the lake, and they had never been pacified by the Spanish, and it will be Pershing's task now to pacify them in the next 2 years, between 1901 and 1903. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of Camp Vickers, considered the most remote American outpost anywhere in the world at that time. Next slide, please. And here's a picture of Pershing, 41 years old. Actually, it says 1903, so he'd be 43 years old at this time. The lake is in the background. He is leading the approach on one of the Moro fortresses called Akata around the lake. Pershing, given this command, falls for it like a fish for water. He loves this. He loves the challenge of it. He loves getting to know Moros, getting to know Moro leaders, working with some, dividing and ruling with others. He spends 4 days talking with Moros. For every day he spends fighting with them. He eventually isolates those who will not cooperate, and then engages in hard war strategy against those in defeating them and taking their katas, or their fortresses. Next slide, please. One of those fortresses, Picolid, has this huge trench around it, and those are American soldiers after the battle. And they had managed to find a way to get across the trench and defeat Picolid and blow up the fortresses. That's just one battle of a number that Pershing engages in a march around that lake. It goes on in 1902 and on into 03. And in the meantime, he becomes famous back in the United States as the hero of Moroland, singled out by President Theodore Roosevelt for praise in his State of the Union address in 1903. Next slide, please. Pershing and his mentor, George Davis, gradually and with mistakes, will develop an indirect method of counterinsurgency warfare. They do this in acknowledging three realities. First of all, they have very few forces, even after the main war is over in the north, very few forces that they will be able to employ. Pershing never has more than 1,000 soldiers at his command. Secondly, President Theodore Roosevelt, facing Senate investigations into atrocities by American troops in the Philippines, orders his commanders to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. And then a third and more complex point, the reality of racial prejudice at that time. In 1902, it was common for white Americans to have certain racial stereotypes and prejudices, as we have today. There was a strong anti-imperialist movement, to be sure, in which Mark Twain plays a very prominent role. But most white Americans at this time assumed that Filipinos in general were uncivilized. They needed to be educated, modernized, and democratized, and Moros, if anything, were seen as even more barbaric than other Filipinos. Pershing from Missouri shares these views. He approves of what he calls the worthy cause of spreading enlightenment and civilization among a horde of Oriental barbarians. He also uncritically accepts the idea that we're all on this pillar with Moros as the savage people down at the bottom and Americans up at the top, and that we're all moving in the same direction. And it's up to Americans to help the poor Moros to become more civilized. So they share these kinds of realities. But Pershing has a good track record by 1901 of commanding minority troops. That started with Oglala Sioux Native Americans in the Dakota Territory. And then, not once, but twice, he helped to command the 10th Cavalry of African American soldiers, first in Montana and then in Cuba, where he's at the bottom of Kettle Hill while Teddy Roosevelt is marching up to San Juan Heights. Because of his command of these minority troops, he is given the name by cadets at West Point when he is there of Nigger Jack. That is later sanitized as Black Jack Pershing, and that's how he gets his term. He's called Black Jack Pershing throughout the rest of his life. Pershing, because of those experiences, approaches Moro leaders or Datus with respect of some sort. Yes, there's a certain amount of condescension. There's no doubt about that. But he admires their courage, their fighting prowess, and their willingness to sacrifice their lives for a higher cause. And so he connects with them. They might be savage, but under the right tutelage, he seems to think of them as having a hopeful future. Next slide, please. And so he begins to evolve a strategy for progressive counterinsurgency warfare here. He's 41, 42 years old, and he's beginning to take a great interest in Moros, Moro culture, and how best to deal with these three realities that we're looking at. Over time, he will develop some very interesting ideas about guerrilla warfare or counterinsurgency warfare. First, cultivate close relations with Moro Datus. He spent, as I said, 4 days cultivating relations with them for everyday fighting. He became a Datu among them, was named by them as one of their Datus. He's a master negotiator, an arbitrator, more than an enforcer. Talk, 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 connect, 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 but always accompany arbitration with military force. 2, get to know everything about your adversary. He will study their language, their culture, their religion, their terrain, their political divisions, their family ties, their factional alignments. It becomes a mania for him, he's accused of. Their economy, their grievances, their social norms, their taboos, their weaponry, their weaknesses, and their strengths. Everything is local. Local, local, local. Tailor your tactics to the local environment. Deal with local grievances. Don't assume that Moros are fighting against you as religious warriors. For most of them, they're fighting against you mainly because you occupy their space and threaten their personal power. You can negotiate with them. You can isolate those who are opposed with you. Be flexible. One size does not fit all. Isolate hardliners, as I just mentioned. Don't get gamed in deadly moral factional infighting. Avoid killing non-combatants. Cultivate close relations with them, and carve out an autonomous political entity called Moro Province. Well, after a few years of doing this, Pershing will return to the United States. There he will meet the love of his life, Helen Frances Warren, daughter of Wyoming Senator Francis Warren, chair of the Military Affairs Committee. That's a good position to have your father-in-law in. And Francis Warren will help Pershing to be promoted. He's still a captain, and he gets promoted in 1906 all the way from captain to brigadier general. He jumps over 862 other candidates in doing that. Okay, a summary of this point in Pershing's career and his activities. In his, in all of this happening on now, he's born in 1860, so he's in his 40s. He deserves credit for evolving a relatively sophisticated counterinsurgency strategy based on ground level experience. It's not based on textbooks. It's really based on his experience there with Moros in the Philippines. Okay, that's the book's first of 3 focal points, Pershing and his development of counterinsurgency efforts. The second focal point is a kind of a case study of competing strategies for counterinsurgency warfare. It's a compelling contrast, and it makes an excellent way to teach about counterinsurgency warfare. While Pershing is gone back to the United States, and he'll be gone from 1903 to 1907, getting married there, a new personality comes to dominate the American role in Moro Province in the Philippines. Next slide, please. And that's General Leonard Wood. Wood serves as the first military commander of Moro Province in 1903 to 1906. He was born in the same year as Pershing, 1860. He's a New Englander, a graduate not of West Point, but of the Harvard Medical School. He joined the Army as an assistant Army contract surgeon in 1885, the same year that Pershing graduates from West Point. He's posted to Arizona. There he displays great courage, tenacity, toughness, and an absolute sense of moral certainty, qualities that come to be trademarks of his character. He rides 3,000 miles across Arizona territory and New Mexico territory in pursuit of Geronimo, and eventually forces Geronimo to give up, and for this he gets the Medal of Honor. He's a lifetime devotee of the active life, physical fitness, riding, hunting, sports, football. He befriends Theodore Roosevelt, and together they command the Rough Riders in Cuba. Later, as president, Roosevelt and he will dress in padded clothing and take up big cudgels and beat on each other until Roosevelt finally says he's had enough of that, Wood being the larger man. But it's hard to believe that Roosevelt backed down on anything. Well, he's now posted. I'm sorry. Let me say one other thing about him. He, after the Spanish-American War in Cuba, he becomes first the mayor of Havana and then governor of Cuba. And he brings great progressive reformist ideas to Cuba. He is particularly given credit for fighting corruption, streamlining the bureaucracy there, and eradicating yellow fever. And he will be promoted too, just like Pershing, in his case, over 530 senior officers. Another great success story in the American military. And now, in 1903, this progressive reformer becomes the first governor of Moro province. And he brings his reformist zeal to Moro province just as he had to Cuba. Next slide, please. We go back to Moro province here now, and Wood will be posted to Zamboanga. That's where he'll be staying. And he immediately looks upon the area and discovers that the Moros are practicing a form of indentured servitude, slavery. Pershing had never mentioned this. Likewise, never mentions the fact that you have multiple wives among many of the Datus in the Moro province. Not so for Wood. Wood believes that if you're there and you're going to put up with things like slavery, which we fought our own war over, then you're simply giving up on your own values. And so he will outlaw slavery and enforce it. He'll also impose a cedula, a head tax on people, and he'll enforce that as well. This is a much more direct form of counterinsurgency than Pershing was comfortable with. In Lanao province, you can see it there, Lake Lanao. He repeats Pershing's march around the lake. In Cotabato, to the south of that, he engages in a scorched earth policy, chasing Datu Ali, his opponent there, and displacing thousands. Next slide, people, please. In Holo, way down in the southern archipelago, south of and west of Zamboanga, he will fight Panglima Hassan there, depicted in this picture, eventually catching him at a volcanic crater and killing him there. In 1906, he engages in the greatest massacre of the Philippine-American War on Mount Daho, Bud Daho. He will defeat and kill 700 to 900 Philippine warriors, Moro warriors, and also their wives and children. In all, in the 32 months that he is in Moro province, he will kill somewhere around 4,000 Moros in fighting and pacifying them. This is a much more active kind of direct counterinsurgency warfare than what Pershing was comfortable with. Next slide, please. And so we have kind of an interesting comparison here that makes for a textbook kind of comparison that I would encourage any of you who are teaching this to use. Wood's much more direct form of counterinsurgency warfare. There's no substitute for military victory. Whereas Pershing is more interested in minimizing violence to the extent that he can. In Wood's case, you're a change agent. Don't deny it. In Pershing's case, try to keep a light footprint. In Wood's case, don't be a hypocrite. Have the courage of your convictions. Why are you here in the first place? In Pershing's case, more respect for local leaders and cultures, some of whom became his friends. De-emphasize cultural and social differences, even if it means letting forms of slavery go on. In summary, This book details a comparative analysis of how the two methods of counterinsurgency warfare, direct and indirect, played out in the Muslim Philippines. It demonstrates the pros and cons of each, and it asks, as I ask you now, which do you support? A third focal point of my work has to do with Pershing's full spectrum counterinsurgency and comparing that with current thinking on counterinsurgency warfare. In 1909, Pershing comes back to Moro province as the new governor. You'll remember that he left way back in 1903. Wood took over and stayed there until 1906. The interim, General Tasker Bliss. But now, in 1909, Pershing takes over, and for the next 4 years, until 1913, he will practice a form of full spectrum counterinsurgency as governor and military commander of the Moros, all in one. Next slide, please. Here he is, together with his love of his life, Frankie. There are 3 children at that time. He'll have a 4th child, Mary Margaret, later. But this is him as he's first posted to Moro province in the southern Philippines. Next slide, please. Pershing at this time faces new realities. And they're not just realities having to do with Moros. Some of them have very much to do with the American situation. By 1909, Americans are sick of this constant war in the southern Philippines against Moros. The realities are he's not going to get any more troops. He's going to have tight budgets that he's going to have to deal with. And there's no guarantee of a long-term military commitment anymore. In fact, all the indicators are, first, from William Howard Taft, and then from Woodrow Wilson, that he'd better prepare Americans, better prepare Filipinos for civilian rule, American rule, and for Filipino rule, rather than American military rule there. Those are the new realities. No more new troops, no money, and no protracted war. Next slide, please. So what's he going to do? Well, one thing we do in looking at counterinsurgency warfare is to look at a triptych of sorts that's not on this slide, but let me just mention it here. What you need to do is to first clear, that is, defeat those who are your warriors against you. Then you need to hold, bringing about peace and order. And then you need to build the new society. Pershing is going to focus on points 1 and 2, but not on point 3. Clear and hold, but not build. That's going to be a crucially important focal point in his way of handling counterinsurgency warfare. He's going to, once again, work with Datus, as he did before, de-emphasize value differences, de-emphasize potentially threatening options like secular education. Yes, he will support some schools, but that's not a major effort on his part from 1909 to 13. Work within their system of justice. You might have an appellate American court that they can go to, but basically they'll stay within their courts, their way of doing things. Emphasize countable improvements. Roads, bridges, trade, healthcare, especially healthcare. Encourage private investment to develop the area and depend on the constabulary instead of American troops. Next slide. Moro constabulary. You build a constabulary police force of Moros themselves. Train them under American leaders, and they will do more, much more than Americans from this point on, 1909 on, in keeping the peace in Moro province. You also will have available, next slide please, Moro Scouts. And these are actually members of the American military, Philippine department, trained, armed to also keep the peace in Moro province. Next slide, please. Well, Moros fight back. And you can't see it at the bottom of this slide, but some of them have guns. And so Pershing engages in the most controversial decision of his life, of his life up to this point. I won't speak about World War I. He decrees disarmament of Muslims. These are people who carry arms all the time up to this point. September 1911, he decrees it is unlawful for any person within Moro province to acquire or possess a rifle, musket, carbine, shotgun, revolver, pistol, or other deadly weapon, or to carry any bowie knife, dirk, dagger, kris, kampilan, spear, or other deadly cutting weapon or thrusting weapon. Imagine this. This would be like Governor Polis of Colorado decreeing disarmament and collecting all the arms of the people of Colorado today. It was just as extreme for Moros. Everybody told him not to do this. Leonard Wood told him not to do this. James Harbord, his friend, particularly in World War I, told them not to do this. But it actually works out better than expected. Next slide, please. Disarmament, and next slide. The new strategy, developed and fully implemented by 1912. Regarding the counterinsurgency triptych of clear, hold, and build that I just described, focus mainly on the first two, clear and hold. Aim for stability and sustainability, not nation building. Depend on the constabulary, not on American troops. Smoke out recalcitrants who won't disarm. He knows there will be some. And destroy them, as he does on Mount Bagsak in June of 1913, where he kills as many as 300 to 500 Moro, but they are all militants. They are not civilians. Women and children are not included at this time because he's able to surround them before women and children join them on the mountain. And then declare victory and go home, essentially. This becomes the new idea. Okay, next slide, please. Does this have relevance to today, the third main point of this presentation? Well, there are certainly many differences. Pershing's situation is much more isolated than we have any situation today. There's no Wahhabi Islam in the Philippines at this time, no Al-Qaeda, no ISIS. It's not nearly such formidable terrain as we have faced in both Iraq and in Afghanistan. It's a smaller population with fewer combatants, and it's even greater disparity in weapons at that time than today. Next slide, please. But there are some interesting similarities. Americans against warriors of Islam. The importance of avoiding religious war. Taking advantage, dividing and rule of age-old ethnic, tribal, and factional divisions. Avoid being gamed by one faction against another. Watch the home front's appetite for war as it declines. To find victory using the limited objective of sustainability and stability. Use a lot of creative thinking. It's very interesting to me that Pershing is facing some of the same things that we have faced in recent years ourselves. American Datu finishes by comparing progressive counterinsurgency as practiced by Pershing with current ideas about counterinsurgency warfare as recommended in the US Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual that came out in 2006. I'm not going to take you through the lengthy comparison and analysis here, but take a look at this next slide. 10 main points. While you're reading through those, let me just simply say that Pershing's progressive counterinsurgency adumbrated most of these points. He fully understood the crucial importance of flexibility and adaptability. He continuously reassessed his operational environment. He became an expert on Moros and their politics and culture as he set out to know the real enemy and not just a cardboard cutout of them. He recognized that successful counterinsurgency requires mastering the skill of building alliances and personal relationships. I can't emphasize that enough with Pershing. That it was so important for him. He based operations on an increasingly sophisticated intelligence network. Over time, he limited most military engagement to small unit actions by highly mobile Philippine scouts and constables, with the exception of that one battle on Badbagsik, a 5-day battle. He avoided asymmetric use of force. He understood the importance of providing security to the local populace, and he tailored tactics to local issues, factions, conditions, always trying to limit or avoid killing or wounding non-combatants. Next slide. The principal differences. We have much of an agreement between counterinsurgency warfare techniques today and what Pershing was doing. But two main differences. First, emphasis in the counterinsurgency manual today is that it's a political struggle, not just a military struggle. Follow the dictum, war is politics by other means, but without political legitimacy, your in-country allies will not succeed, and you won't succeed either. You can win every battle and still lose the war. Clausewitz. I agree with that. But Pershing, he supported politics to some extent, some form of autonomy for Moro province, appointing Datus as district governors, but basically don't mess with politics. Pershing is not into that. He hates politics. He was a terrible politician himself, by the way. When he comes back from World War I in 1920, he's the #1 candidate for president to succeed Wilson. And he's a terrible speaker, terrible politician. He, in his first primary in Nebraska, he comes in 3rd, and that's by then his home state. So he bows out, never becomes a major political figure at all. Don't try to build democratic institutions from his point of view. That's going to be the case, the situation, the task of others, not him. The second general point of difference is the triptych that I described earlier: clear, hold, and build. For Pershing, just focus on the first two. It's not your responsibility to build a new society. Leave the nation building, democracy, secular education, gender equality, things like that to others. That's not the military's job. So, Pershing attains a degree of stability by 1913 as governor of Moro province and leader of the troops there. After Badbagsik defeated most of the opponents, he's ready now to go home and give governance to American civilians led by Frank Carpenter, and also to Filipinos and Moros themselves. And so he leaves and goes back to the United States in 1913. Last slide, please. What have we got to learn from all this? Well, lots. And I hope you'll take a look at my book. But this summary pretty much summarizes what I've said. Never lose sight of the objective that got you there in the first place. In his case, it was pacification, stabilization, preparation for civilian rule. 2, face your realities. Always face those realities. Notice at the very beginning, he was facing the reality of Moros in Lanao, around that lake. Later, he was facing the realities of Moros throughout the province. Keep asking, what are the realistic limits of what we can do on the home front? What can you expect there? Politics in terms of local leadership, and cost in lives and money, length of commitment. Don't ever lose touch with these. Face your realities. And 3, devise a strategy that works within these realistic limits. And so by hook or by crook, and with many mistakes along the way, I think, that's what Pershing did. I believe that we could benefit from his example today. What do you think? I open it to questions.
Okay, all right. We have 2 questions, Mr. Edgerton, so I'll lead off with number 1. The question is, this individual states that he had a relative in the Philippines serving with, I believe, the 8th Cavalry in 1912, and he wanted to know where he could get more information.
I would start at the Military Heritage Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. and I would ask for help from Chuck Payne and others. I have been there many times, and I'm very fortunate to have a sister who lives in Carlisle, and I stay with her. And I would highly recommend that as a place to do some research and look into the situation with your relative in 1912. I would also go to the National Archives and ask for help there as well. Between those 2 places, you should be able to find just about anything you need to know or anything that's available on your relative in 1912.
Okay, let me just add that for our listeners, the Army Heritage Center has a online site whereby anyone, anywhere can access our holdings, which are voluminous. And so to the individual that asked that particular question, you can log right on to, again, that website, the Army Heritage Center, and log into the, or pull up the menu and look at the holdings and enter whatever you're looking for, and you might be able to find something from the comfort of your home. So let me just ask you, Mr. Edgerton, when you were doing your research, did you find a large amount of material? Well, I mean, could you just give everyone a little bit more information as to what you were able to find regarding your subject?
Yes, thank you for asking that. I did a lot of research in the Library of Congress manuscripts division, which is just absolutely an amazing wealth of archival materials, including the Pershing papers, including the papers of many, many other people who were involved in American military strategy at that time, and civilian, of course, as well. Highly recommend that. A delightful place to work, excellent staff. I also worked in Carlisle, as I've mentioned, and I also worked in the National Archives. And there are a number of different branches in the National Archives that you can use, one of which is the photograph, the collection of photographs. That is fabulous. That is really wonderful. And the staff there is excellent as well. There are other areas that you could go into depending on your top specific topics, but those would be the 3 that I would really, really emphasize.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have another question. The writer states or asks, how would you compare this war with Vietnam? And I'm assuming he means in terms of counterinsurgency.
Okay. this war, first of all, has not been studied. Very, very little has been written on the American struggle against Muslims in the Philippines. The Philippine-American War has occasioned more analysis, some excellent analysis, in fact. But this particular part that I've described, very, very little has been written on that. In the case of Vietnam, a great deal, of course, has been written. And what we have in Vietnam is the situation where the American military has overwhelming force, 543,000 Americans in Vietnam at one point, at one time, and many, many others over the course of time. Pershing, Wood, they never had anything like that in the Philippines. Never more than 5,000. Pershing never was able to employ more than 1,000 men on any particular engagement. And so they dealt with they had to deal with limited warfare. That was crucial in everything that they were doing. They also didn't have the funding, and they didn't have the support at home. And so everything was predicated on those limits. I would suggest that America needs in the future to learn something about those kinds of limits and fighting a war within certain limits. The idea that we can just do anything, anywhere, anyhow, for any amount of expense really has turned out to be, I think, a major problem for the United States. Pershing was dealing with very limited resources, including in weaponry. And he made the best with what he did, and his imprint, he left much less of an imprint because of that. Yes, you have in the Philippines today, in the Moro Philippines, believe it or not, where they were his enemies at one point, it's very typical in many towns in the Moro areas of the Philippines to have Pershing Square at the center of the town, including Zamboanga. And he is remembered as a person who was a Datu, a fellow chief with Moros, even as he was fighting against those who held out against Americans. So we're dealing here with something that was an American expeditionary force fighting with really, really important limits, and knowing that it had those limits. And I would suggest that forced decisions, such as working with Moros, that we haven't always had to force, or we haven't always had to face since then, and we need to face if we're going to be successful in the future.
That is absolutely fascinating. That is a great overview. Thank you. That to me is phenomenal.
That to me is a really wonderful question. What did we do in Vietnam? What did we do in the Philippines? And comparing those and learning from them, boy, oh boy, I hope that's going on right now in West Point. I hope it's going on in the Naval Academy and Air Force Academy. That's exactly the kind of thing that we need to be asking. And what can we learn from Pershing? What can we learn from Wood and their experiences in the Philippines? Yes, yes, yes. Ask that question. That's exactly what we should be doing.
I would add that in fact, I know those discussions are ongoing regarding our current activities, or I should say past activities in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. But let me move on to our next question. This one's a little lengthier, and it is, to what extent and in what ways do you think the current Philippine leadership is using Pershing's style of counterinsurgency against today's Moros in Marawi or elsewhere? Or have they developed a different strategy?
Excellent question. First of all, we do have 400 or so American Special Forces working with Philippine armed forces in Mindanao today. They're advisors. They are not in a fighting capacity, but they are advising them. They tend to be advising them based on experience from Vietnam and also from Iraq and Afghanistan rather than from the Philippine experience of Pershing. I think that's unfortunate. I think that advice could come much more from Pershing's experience, which was much more successful. But that indeed is exactly the situation. Philippine Armed Forces fought 5 months in Marawi, completely destroyed the city, forced 360,000 evacuees, large numbers of deaths, destroyed that. Duterte has sworn to continue that kind of thing if necessary, but turned around and did sign that Bangsamoro Pact in 2018. The plebiscite confirmed it in 2019. And so today there is some hope for really an end to that war. At this point, it is just simmering. You have Philippine Armed Forces in Mindanao, all across parts of Mindanao, particularly in Cotabato today. And they are there, but they are not being used very much because the insurgency there has really diminished a great deal. The Philippine Armed Forces' willingness to negotiate, particularly with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, has split the Moros, the Moro militants. The Islamic Liberation Front now supports autonomy, but the Moro National Liberation Front, Nur Miswari's outfit, continues to demand independence and will not cooperate with the Islamic Liberation Front. And so there is now a division among Moros in their fighting against the Philippine Armed Forces. That is a significant development that works to the advantage of the Philippine Armed Forces. So at this point, things are relatively quiet and relatively hopeful. The last year in Moro province has been generally a very good year for development, for what's the word I'm looking for investment from the Philippines, and some foreign investment may be possible again in the future as well. That ended completely during the major parts of the war in 2017. But there is hope there. I would say at this point, well, I'm going to decide to be hopeful.
Excellent, sir. Well, it looks like that concludes our questions. So at this point, Mr. Edgerton, do you have any final comments for us tonight before we close?
Well, I think that the point that I would love to get across, and I'm not sure that I did, is to look at people that you're studying, whether it's Pershing or Wood or anyone, as works in progress. We tend to see them as who they become. But I see Pershing as someone who is really developing his ideas over the years, making them more and more sophisticated, more and more interesting, becoming a more and more interesting kind of person. The man who leads the American Expeditionary Forces in the Great War is a very different man than the man who takes over the guerrilla warfare effort against Muslims in the Philippines in 1901 in Lanao. He evolves, he changes, he matures, he learns a great deal about himself. And one of the most significant things about his effort in World War I, in the Meuse-Argonne battle, the great final battle in September, October, and into November of 1918 until the end of the war on November 11th. One of the most extraordinary things about that is Pershing's decision at first to send American forces against German lines at great cost to American lives. And then eventually, by mid-October, late October, he is ready to turn over the leadership of the actual fighting to Hunter Liggett, one of his commanders, and to stand back himself and take over general leadership of the American Expeditionary Forces in France, to take care of the horrible snafu in supplies, for example, and to begin to see himself as a commander of a total war effort and leave the tactics to Hunter Liggett. That turned out to be absolutely the right choice. He would not have been able to make that choice if he hadn't had the experience of understanding the mistakes that he made and that I describe in this book in the Philippines when he was a much younger man. Mistakes he made, some of them really he regretted, and yet also his successes and how he learned and changed in the course of that time. And so I see him as a complete person and somebody that we could learn from by seeing him in process, not just as the final version.
Well, very interestingly, we've had one other question pop up while you were speaking, and
Keep
it's
them
somewhat
coming. Keep
very
them coming.
germane to
I
those
won't be able to
remarks.
answer all of them, but I love their questions.
Well, what we're going to do then, I'm going to ask you this one last question, and then, ladies and gentlemen, we'll conclude the presentation. Again, this actually, I think, will satellite very well with what you just said. So here's the question. Great job. Pershing's lesson apply to the Vietnam War as well. However, the corrosive effects of corruption seem to have defeated our best efforts. How did Pershing address this?
I'm not sure whether that's a reference to corruption in the on the American side of things.
I'm not either. Could the writer, if you're listening, clarify that real quick, your question? And let's see if we get a response here.
Pershing understood that there was corruption among Filipinos. He didn't get along very well with Filipinos other than Moros.
He just wrote here, both sides were at fault.
Okay. Pershing saw Filipino government, the government of Manuel Quezon and Sergio Osmeña, for example, Manuel Rojas, as deeply corrupt, and that bothered him very much. He tried to limit corruption as he saw it in Mindanao. But if you look at the way Moros operate, the way their society operates, you could define a lot of that as corruption. For example, in their justice system, a person commits a crime against some other Moro. Maybe he runs off with his neighbor's wife. Do you take him to a court of law there and find him guilty and punish him in jail? No. You admit that this is a mistake. You get him into a negotiation situation, and then you find restorative justice of some sort. Working with the victim and the perpetrator, you come up with a solution to the agreement of everybody. What does that mean? That agreement might be that the perpetrator gives a certain number of his carabao, or his cattle, or his chickens, or his life savings to the victim to cool the hot heart of the victim, so that the victim doesn't go out and start killing any member of the perpetrator's family that he happens to see, and causing more and more friction and violence in the society. You find a negotiated settlement. Now, you're buying him off in a way. What do you do about that? The perpetrator might not have these kinds of chickens and cattle and so forth. And so the Datu, the chief of that person, becomes the negotiator. He gives his cattle, his chickens, to make the settlement. And then in return, he enslaves the perpetrator in indentured servitude to him. Now, that's not an easy moral situation to work out. There are a bunch of iffy things there. That's not how our legal system works at all. But that is, in fact, the way things work there. Negotiation, negotiation, negotiation. Kind of not talking about absolute rights and wrongs. And the end result is a workable system. Pershing got very good at that, actually. And he became one of those negotiators, one of those arbitrators who was valued and eventually elected as a Datu there. He was able to fit into that system, even though it had some very morally questionable kinds of things by our moral code.
Well, Mr. Edgerton, I think that sums it up very well. I will tell you, I just received a note from one of our participants, and I'm going to read it to you because I concur 100%. He writes, "Fabulous presentation. Thanks for this very informative lecture, a treasure for reference and analysis of our recent counterinsurgency engagement." And again, he said, "Thanks very much. Fascinating talk." And I believe that sums it up for all of us. Thank you so much for an extremely informative and meaningful presentation, and one that has, I believe, great relevance to historians and, of course, to the Army, as well as all our services and government. So thank you very much for your time and effort in entertaining us and informing us. I'd like to say to all our participants, again, on behalf of Mike Perry and the Army Heritage Center, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope that you'll join us again for future presentations. Mr. Edgerton, if you're ever in Carlisle, please stop by the Heritage Center so we can chat and have an opportunity to meet you.
I'll be there for sure. And thank you, Chuck. This has been a pure pleasure.
You bet, sir. All right, everyone, that takes care of it. Have a good evening.